There is a specific kind of mistake that powerful people make, or people who believe themselves powerful, which in practical terms amounts to the same thing that ordinary people almost never make. It is the mistake of acting without information. Not without complete information, because nobody ever has complete information. Without basic information. The minimum information that a person exercising authority over someone else's property should have before they exercise that authority. Information like, who is this person? What do they do? What is the thing I am about to take, and why does it exist on their property in the quantity it exists? What happens if I take it? These are not difficult questions. They require perhaps 10 minutes of basic inquiry before acting, but powerful people or people who believe themselves powerful often skip these questions because the asking of them implies a constraint on the action, and the action is what they have already decided to do. The HOA president of Creekside Meadows did not ask these questions before she and 2 board members drove to my property on a Thursday morning with a trailer and helped themselves to 6 of my propane tanks. She did not ask what the tanks were for. She did not ask why I had 6 of them rather than the standard one. She did not ask what I did for a living or why my property had an amount of propane infrastructure that was, she might have noted, if she had been thinking carefully, considerably more substantial than a standard residential installation. She did not ask any of these things because she had already decided what she was doing, and asking questions would have complicated a decision that felt, to her, obvious. Her name was Janet Holbrook. She was 54 years old, the HOA president for 7 years, and the owner of the particular certainty that 7 years of unchallenged local authority produces. She had a documented history of treating the community's emergency preparedness provisions as a personal mandate and other people's property as a community resource. She had a trailer with a propane tank mount that her husband had built specifically for moving tanks, which told you something about the frequency with which she had done this before. And she had, on that Thursday morning in October, absolutely no idea that the 6 tanks she was loading onto that trailer represented a problem of a scale and complexity that was going to take 3 weeks, 2 county officials, a federal regulatory consultation, and a significant amount of personal legal exposure to fully resolve. I want to be fair about something before I go any further. The emergency preparedness provision in the Creekside Meadows HOA guidelines was real. It had been past 6 years before this incident, at a meeting where Janet had made a compelling case that the community needed a formal mechanism for pooling resources during declared emergencies. The provision allowed the HOA to temporarily requisition surplus utility resources, generators, fuel, water storage, from homeowners in the event of a county-declared emergency, with compensation at fair market value and return of the resources when the emergency concluded. The provision had been passed in good faith by a board that genuinely believed it was creating a useful community resilience mechanism. The provision had 3 problems that Janet had either not noticed or had chosen not to think carefully about. The first problem was that a county-declared emergency had not been declared. There had been a weather advisory, a frost warning for the upcoming weekend, but a frost warning was not a county-declared emergency in any legal or administrative sense. It was a weather forecast. Janet had decided that the frost warning constituted sufficient grounds for emergency preparedness activation, because she had, in her 7 years as HOA president, developed the habit of making definitional decisions unilaterally and without challenge. The second problem was that the provision applied to surplus utility resources. The 6 tanks she had taken were not surplus. They were operational infrastructure for a licensed commercial fuel distribution business. They were not sitting on my property because I had more propane than I needed as a homeowner. They were there because my property was the registered depot location for Callaway Fuel Supply, the licensed propane distribution company that I had owned and operated for 14 years, and that supplied propane to residential, commercial, and industrial customers across 3 counties. The third problem was the federal one. Propane is a regulated fuel. Its storage, transport, and distribution are governed by a layered set of federal, state, and local regulations administered through multiple agencies. The tanks at my depot were not just any propane tanks. They were certified commercial propane storage vessels, registered with the state fire marshal, inspected annually by a licensed third-party inspector, and covered by a commercial general liability policy that required them to remain at their registered location, except during authorized delivery operations conducted by licensed operators in licensed vehicles. Moving them without authorization from the depot, removing them from their registered location, was not a property dispute. It was a regulatory violation with exposure that included state fire marshal jurisdiction, propane industry regulatory jurisdiction, and because the distribution operation crossed county lines, potential federal motor carrier fuel regulation involvement. Janet had taken 6 commercially registered propane storage vessels from a licensed fuel distribution depot using a private trailer operated by a non-licensed individual. She had done this based on a frost warning. Let me give you the full picture of who I am and what was on that property, because you need it to understand both what Janet had walked into and what happened next. My name is Thomas Calloway. I am 51 years old. I have lived in Creekside Meadows for 9 years. I bought my property specifically because of its acreage, 4.5 acres on the edge of the community, bordered on the west by a county road and on the north by agricultural land, and because the zoning permitted commercial operations of the type I operated, which was a condition I had verified with the county planning office before purchase and documented thoroughly. Calloway Fuel Supply had been operating from this location for 8 of the 9 years I had been there. The operation was fully licensed, fully permitted, fully insured, and known to every relevant county and state agency. What the HOA apparently did not know, or had not bothered to confirm, was any of this. My property from the street looked like a large residential lot, with an unusually substantial outbuilding and several large tanks visible on the north side of the property beyond a screening hedge that I had planted specifically to minimize the visual impact of the commercial operation on the residential neighborhood. From a distance, without walking the property or making any inquiry, the tanks could look like an enthusiastic homeowner's propane setup. They were not. They were 6 250-gallon commercial storage vessels, each with permanent identification markings from the state fire marshal's registration, each connected to the depot's distribution manifold by properly engineered piping, each with a valve configuration that was immediately distinguishable to anyone with propane system knowledge as commercial rather than residential. Janet did not have propane system knowledge. What she had was a trailer and a decision. I was not at the property when the seizure happened. I was in the field. I had been out since 6 a.m. doing deliveries, which in October meant early starts because heating season had begun and residential customers were filling their tanks for winter. My depot manager, a woman named Carol who had been with Calloway Fuel for 11 years and who was, in terms of operational competence, the best employee I had ever had, was at the depot when Janet and the 2 board members arrived at approximately 9:30 a.m. Carol told me later that she had been in the office, a converted outbuilding adjacent to the depot's main storage area, when she heard a vehicle and a trailer pull up on the north side of the property. She had gone out expecting a delivery confirmation or a pickup customer. What she found was Janet Holbrook and 2 men she recognized as HOA board members standing next to a pickup truck with a tank trailer examining the storage area. Carol said she had asked them what they were doing. Janet had produced a copy of the HOA's emergency preparedness provision and said they were requisitioning fuel resources under the Community Emergency Protocol. Carol said she had told them this was a commercial fuel depot and not a residential property, and that the tanks were commercial property of a licensed fuel distribution company. Janet said the property was within the Creekside Meadows community and was subject to HOA provisions like all other properties. Carol said she was calling me immediately. Janet said she would wait. Carol called me at 9:47 a.m. I was in the truck between deliveries, about 12 miles from the depot. She told me what was happening. I told her to tell Janet clearly that the tanks were commercial property of a regulated fuel business and that removing them was a regulatory violation and that they should not load anything onto the trailer. I said I was on my way. Carol relayed this. Janet apparently said she was operating under community authority and would proceed. By the time I arrived at the depot at 10:23 a.m., I drove directly from my delivery location. 2 of the 6 tanks had been loaded onto the trailer. The other 4 were being prepared for loading. I parked the delivery truck and walked directly to Janet, and I said stop. She looked at me with the expression of an HOA president who has encountered resistance she had not expected from the property she was managing. I said my name and told her Callaway Fuel Supply was a licensed propane distribution company and that the tanks she was loading were commercially registered storage vessels and that removing them from their registered location was a regulatory violation under state fire marshal rules and federal propane distribution regulations. I said the tanks needed to come back off the trailer immediately. She said the community emergency provision gave the HOA authority to requisition surplus fuel resources and that my tanks qualified. I said they did not qualify because they were not surplus. They were active inventory in a commercial distribution operation. I said there was no county-declared emergency that activated the provision. I said even if the provision applied, it did not override commercial fuel regulations. And I said if she drove off my property with those tanks, she was going to have a very serious problem with multiple regulatory agencies within the next 24 hours. She said she was confident in the HOA's authority. I said I was going to make 3 phone calls, and she could either put the tanks back while I was making them, or she could leave with them and face the consequences of that choice. She said she would stay, and we could discuss it further. I made the calls from the depot office with the door open so Janet could hear that I was making them. The first call was to my attorney, Margaret Sullivan, who handled Callaway Fuel's commercial and regulatory matters and who had been my attorney for 12 years. I explained the situation in about 90 seconds. Margaret said, "Do not let those tanks leave the property and give me 20 minutes. I said I would do my best." The second call was to the State Fire Marshal's regional office, whose number I had in my phone because I called it approximately twice a year for routine regulatory matters. I reported that 2 commercially registered propane storage vessels were being loaded onto a private trailer by non-licensed individuals at my depot address, and that I was requesting emergency regulatory intervention. The duty officer said she was going to escalate the report and would call me back. The third call was to the County Emergency Management Director, a man named Dale Whitfield, whom I had known professionally for 6 years, because Callaway Fuel was the county's primary contracted propane supplier for emergency operations, meaning that when the county needed propane for emergency heating, emergency generators, or emergency operations generally, they called me. Dale and I had worked together on 3 separate county emergency responses in the previous 6 years. He knew who I was, and he knew what my operation was. I told Dale that the Creekside Meadows HOA president was at my depot loading commercial propane storage vessels onto a private trailer under a purported community emergency provision. Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said the county did not have an active emergency declaration. I said I was aware of that. He said a frost warning was not a county emergency declaration. I said I was aware of that too. He said he would make a call. I went back outside. Janet and the 2 board members were standing by the trailer. The 2 loaded tanks were still on it. I told Janet that I had reported the situation to the State Fire Marshal's office and the County Emergency Management Director, and that I expected to hear back shortly, and that I was asking her again to put the tanks back. She said she would wait for those calls before making any decision. We waited for approximately 18 minutes. During those 18 minutes, nobody said very much. Carol stood near the depot office. Janet and the 2 board members stood near the trailer. I stood at a point equidistant between them. It was a cold October morning, and the frost warning that had initiated this situation had materialized. There was frost on the ground and on the tops of the tanks, and on the hood of Janet's pickup truck. My phone rang. It was Margaret. Margaret said she had made 3 calls in 18 minutes, and what she had confirmed was this. The tanks were registered commercial storage vessels under State Fire Marshal registration number, which she read to me. Their registered location was my depot address. Removing them from their registered location without a properly documented transport authorization constituted a violation of the State Propane Storage Code. The individual who transporting them without authorization was personally liable for the violation. The HOA's emergency provisions did not and could not override state commercial fuel regulations. If the tanks left my property on that trailer, Janet Holbrook was personally exposed to a state fire marshal citation, potential fine, and possible license-related consequences if she held any professional licenses. The HOA was exposed as an organization. Margaret said she was prepared to document all of this in a formal letter to Janet within the hour if I wanted her to. I said yes and put Margaret on hold. I walked to Janet and I said my attorney was on the phone and had confirmed the regulatory situation and was preparing a formal letter. I said the State Fire Marshal's office had the report and was responding. I said the County Emergency Management Director was making calls. I said the tanks needed to go back on the pad right now. Janet looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the tanks on the trailer. Then she looked at the 2 board members who were both looking at various points in the middle distance with the expression of people who were beginning to understand that they had participated in something that was considerably more serious than they had been told it was. She told the board members to put the tanks back. It took about 20 minutes to offload the 2 tanks from the trailer and reconnect them to the pad. I watched every step. Carol documented it with photographs. When the tanks were back and the trailer was detached from the truck, I told Janet that I expected a formal written acknowledgement from the HOA within 72 hours that the tanks had been removed without authorization, that the action was a violation of my property rights and commercial regulations, and that it would not be repeated. I said I expected the acknowledgement to be signed by all board members. I said if I did not receive it, I would be pursuing the matter through every available channel, including the State Fire Marshal, the County Emergency Management Office, and civil litigation. Janet did not respond. She got in the pickup truck and drove away. The 2 board members drove away separately. I stood in my depot and breathed. Then I went inside and wrote down everything that had happened in the order it had happened with every timestamp I could reconstruct. Carol had her own notes, and we compared them and produced a combined chronological account that was 9 pages long and covered every word and action from 9:30 to approximately 11:15. I sent the account to Margaret that afternoon. The letter Margaret sent to Janet Holbrook and to each board member individually by certified mail on Friday morning was 18 pages long and was the most thorough legal document I had seen outside of actual litigation. Margaret had spent Thursday afternoon and Friday morning on it, and it showed. The letter documented the incident chronologically, identified every regulatory provision that the seizure had implicated, named the specific federal and state statutes and regulations that governed commercial propane storage and transport, described the personal legal exposure of Janet Holbrook and the 2 board members who had participated in loading the tanks onto the trailer, described the HOA's organizational exposure, and explained in detail why the emergency preparedness provision in the HOA's guidelines did not and could not authorize the action that had been taken. The letter also included something I had asked Margaret to add and that she had agreed was appropriate. It included a description of Callaway Fuel Supply's operational significance to the county, specifically the fact that Callaway Fuel was the county's primary contracted propane supplier for emergency operations, and that the 6 tanks Janet had attempted to seize were part of the operational inventory that made Callaway Fuel capable of fulfilling that contract. The letter noted that if a county emergency had been declared, a real one properly declared, and Callaway Fuel's inventory had been depleted or compromised by the HOA's unauthorized seizure, the county's emergency fuel supply would have been directly impacted. This was not a hypothetical. It was an operational reality that the County Emergency Management Director's office had confirmed in a brief letter that Margaret had obtained on Friday morning and attached to her own letter as an exhibit. The attached letter from the County Emergency Management Director's office was brief and formal and devastating in its effect. It said that Callaway Fuel Supply was the county's primary propane supplier under a current emergency operations contract, that the county's emergency propane reserves were dependent on Callaway Fuel's operational capacity, and that any disruption to Callaway Fuel's inventory or operations could directly impact the county's ability to respond to declared emergencies. It was signed by Dale Whitfield. I read both letters on Friday morning at my kitchen table. Margaret had done excellent work. The legal analysis was precise and comprehensive, and the exhibit from Dale was the kind of thing that makes the recipient of a letter understand, in a way that no amount of legal language alone can produce, that they have made an error of genuine consequence. The certified mail receipts came back signed by Janet on Monday and by all 3 board members by Wednesday. The return receipt from one of the board members, the one whose signature came back first, before presumably the board members had coordinated their response, included a handwritten note on the back of the receipt that said simply, "I had no idea. I did not show this to anyone." I felt something about it that was closer to sympathy than to satisfaction. The man who had written it was probably telling the truth. He probably had had no idea. The formal written acknowledgement I had requested arrived on Thursday, 7 days after the incident, 4 days after Margaret's letter. It was on HOA letterhead and was signed by all 5 board members, including Janet. It acknowledged that on Thursday, the 5th of October, the HOA had removed 2 commercially registered propane storage vessels from the property of Thomas Callaway without proper authorization. It acknowledged that this action was a violation of Mr. Callaway's property rights and constituted a regulatory compliance concern under applicable commercial propane storage regulations. It acknowledged that the HOA's emergency preparedness provision did not authorize the requisition of commercially registered fuel inventory from a licensed fuel distribution operation. It committed that the HOA would not take any further action involving Mr. Callaway's commercial fuel inventory or property without his written consent, and it was notarized. Margaret reviewed the acknowledgement and said it was legally sufficient and that I should file it with the county recorder's office to make it part of the public record. I did. I also, in the 10 days following the incident, had 3 separate conversations with regulatory contacts that I want to describe briefly because they were part of what made the full picture complete. The first was with the State Fire Marshal's regional duty officer who had taken my initial report. She called me back on the Friday after the incident to confirm that my report had been received and processed, and to confirm that the tanks had been returned to the registered location. She said the office was documenting the incident in its regulatory files as an attempted unauthorized transport of registered commercial propane vessels, and that if any similar incident involving my property occurred in the future, I should report it immediately and the response would be faster. She said the office had been in contact with the HOA and had conveyed the regulatory situation to them directly. I asked what that conversation had involved, and she said it had involved a clear explanation of what the state's propane storage regulations meant and what the consequences of violating them were. I said I appreciated that. The second conversation was with Dale Whitfield at the County Emergency Management Office. Dale called me on the following Monday. He said he wanted to confirm that the situation had been resolved and that my operation was intact. I said it was. He said he was sorry I had had to deal with it and that he had had a conversation with the HOA's board that he felt confident would not need to be repeated. I asked what he had said. He said he had explained that Callaway Fuel Supply's operational capacity was a matter of county emergency preparedness significance, and that any interference with that capacity was something the county took seriously. He said he had also explained that the frost warning that had apparently prompted the HOA's action was not and had never been a county-declared emergency, and that the HOA's emergency preparedness provision could only be activated in the event of a properly declared county emergency, which he as emergency management director would communicate clearly when and if such a declaration occurred. I thanked Dale. He said anytime and that he would see me at the next county emergency operations planning meeting. I said he would. The third conversation was with my insurance broker, who called me because Carol had notified the insurance company of the incident as standard procedure when anything involving the depot's physical assets occurred. The broker said the incident was documented and that my coverage was unaffected, and that he wanted to confirm that I understood my commercial general liability policy required the tanks to remain at their registered location except during authorized delivery operations. I said I was fully aware of that requirement and that the tanks had been returned before leaving the property. He said good and that he was glad to hear it and that the documentation was in the file. The Creekside Meadows HOA held a special meeting 2 weeks after the incident. I attended. 41 homeowners attended, which was the largest meeting attendance in the community's history. The meeting had been called by 6 homeowners who had submitted a joint request for a governance review of the HOA's emergency preparedness provision and its application. The meeting was long and substantive. A community association attorney had been retained by the board to advise on the legal situation, and he gave a clear and unsparing summary of the regulatory issues the incident had created and the personal exposure the board members had incurred. Several homeowners asked pointed questions about the process by which the decision had been made to activate the emergency provision without a declared emergency. Janet's answers to those questions were, in my assessment, not adequate, and the room's assessment appeared to match mine based on the visible and audible responses to what she said. At the end of the meeting, the board voted on 3 resolutions. The first revised the emergency preparedness provision to require that activation be triggered only by a formally declared county, state, or federal emergency, with the declaration documented in the board's minutes before any requisition action was taken. The second required that before any property action under the provision, the board obtain a written legal opinion from a qualified attorney confirming that the action was within the HOA's authority. The third required that any property subject to a requisition action be personally identified and confirmed with the property owner before the action was taken, with a minimum 48-hour notice period, except in situations where the county emergency management director confirmed that the emergency required immediate action. All 3 resolutions passed unanimously. Janet abstained on the first one. I voted yes on all 3. The governance review that the 6 homeowners had requested led, over the following months, to a broader review of the HOA's authority provisions that identified 2 other provisions that were similarly broad and similarly poorly defined. Both were revised through a homeowner consultation process that William, a board member who had voted for all 3 resolutions without hesitation and who clearly understood that the board needed to rebuild some credibility, organized with genuine care. The consultation process was the first time in 7 years of Janet's presidency that homeowners had been systematically consulted about guideline revisions before those revisions were voted on. Janet Holbrook served out the remaining 4 months of her term. She did not run for re-election. William ran and was elected by the largest margin in the community's election history. He has been HOA president for 2 years, and I have had no further incidents involving my property or my operation. Callaway Fuel Supply continues to supply propane to residential, commercial, and industrial customers across 3 counties. Our county emergency operations contract was renewed 8 months after the incident with an expanded scope. We added an additional 300 gallons of emergency reserve capacity that is maintained specifically for county emergency use, and that is formally documented in the contract and in the county's emergency operations plan. The reserve tanks are, by specific contractual provision, not subject to any HOA provision or private party claim. This provision was Dale Whitfield's idea, and I thought it was an excellent one. The 6 storage tanks are on their pad on the north side of the depot property, where they have been since I installed them 8 years ago. They are inspected annually. They are filled on a schedule that maintains our operational capacity for both commercial distribution and emergency reserve. The state fire marshal's registration is current. The insurance coverage is current. Carol reviews the compliance documentation quarterly and has not found a deficiency in 8 years of doing so. On a Tuesday morning, approximately 3 months after the incident, I was at the depot doing a routine inventory check when I saw a car I recognized as Janet Holbrook's drive slowly past on the county road that bordered the west side of my property. She did not stop. The car slowed slightly as it passed the section of the property where the storage area was visible through the screening hedge, and then continued down the road. I watched the car go. I noted the time in my log, not out of any specific concern, but because the habit of documentation is one I maintain regardless of whether I expect it to be needed. The car did not come back. The property remained as it was, fully operational, fully compliant, fully mine. Carol brought coffee to where I was standing by the tanks. We stood there for a moment in the October cold, the same kind of cold that had been in the air the morning Janet had arrived with her trailer, and drank our coffee and looked at the storage area and said nothing in particular. Sometimes the best response to a concluded situation is the silence of things that are working as they are supposed to work. The tanks were full. The operation was running. The county had its emergency supplier, and the emergency supplier had its tanks, and the HOA had its revised provision, and Janet had her car and her frost warnings, and whatever she made of them now. Everything was where it belonged. Thumbnail text. Line 1, HOA Karen seized my propane tanks for emergency use. She had no idea I was the county's official emergency fuel supplier face with steam from nose. Line 2, then the fire marshal, county emergency director, and my lawyer hit her with everything at once, and she had to sign a legal apology fire.